Hello, everyone. Professor Philip Travis here. This week, we're going to be looking at the United States' emergence as a world power. In particular, we're going to be focusing on the Philippine American War. So, historians, when we talk about the United States becoming a world power, historians are generally referring to the United States as the development of the United States as an overseas world power, which refers to really largely events beginning in 1898 with the Spanish American War and then the Philippine American War. The Spanish American War, of course, involved U.S. Military actions against Spanish held Cuba and also Spanish Puerto Rico, but it then expanded to a U.S. first naval operation against the Spanish Philippines. The Spanish had colonized, of course, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines. In the Philippines, after the Spanish were defeated, largely through the assistance of groups led by Filipino nationalist Emilio Aguinaldo, who would have hoped that the United States would have granted the Philippines independence, the United States ultimately fought a brutal war against the Filipinos in the Philippines. A war that cost maybe 60,000 Filipino deaths, close to 5,000 American deaths. And the United States would ultimately seize the Philippines as a colony. It would maintain the colony of the Philippines until 1946. In the same context, the United States, of course, took Puerto Rico as a territory. It annexed Hawaii as well, which was unrelated to anything involving the Spanish. And, of course, it took territories from Cuba, like Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, which it holds still to this day. So this is the period in the 20th century we really refer to the United States becoming a world power, becoming a country with at least an intent to have a sort of global naval power, its drives for trade, for territory, for global influence in the name of economic benefit through trade, in the name of national defense through imperial competition with other world powers, and so forth. So this is the period we're talking about. This week, we're not going to have a discussion forum. Instead, we're going to have two quizzes. Going back to last week, our discussion of American sort of core ideas, core values, I should say. What does the United States, what should the United States represent as a country? Of course, some of those ideas, they're going to change over time, and certainly, perhaps some aspects may or may not be argued and debated about at different times in American history. But generally speaking, what we're talking about is the United States as a country that champions, for example, representative government. It champions the ideal of human rights and fair treatment before the law. It champions the ideals of individual rights. It champions the ideal of capitalism, from the sense of individuals being able to sort of pursue the American dream. These are the kinds of things that we're really talking about when we think about what the United States is supposed to represent: human rights, individual rights, fair, equal treatment, justice, anti-monarchialism, and connected to that, of course, traditionally anti-colonialism, given the experience of the United States resisting the British colonial power during the American Revolution. So core values enshrined in representative government and in people's rights, as well as the ideal role of the nation in the world. Those are the types of things we're really talking about when we're thinking core values, core ideas. What does the United States, what should the United States really be representing in the world? When the United States emerged as a world power and began to be engaged increasingly in overseas conflicts, sometimes overseas conflicts that were quite brutal and not immediately necessary in terms of any kind of direct threat to the United States, some of these conflicts, all of these conflicts that we're going to look at in this class shape society. But a lot of times these conflicts, too, challenge some of those core ideas. And when we look at the Philippine American War, we see this. Some historians, like Stuart Crichton Miller, who we'll be reading this week, have referred to this conflict as almost like America's first Vietnam. And that'll make more sense when we get to talking about the Vietnam War. But the Philippine American War, like Vietnam, it really brought some real intense debates in American society over these core values. And you see here, this is a political cartoon. And the political cartoon was in the New York Journal. And it came out in 1902. And it used words from a general, General Jacob Smith, who, when the guerrilla war, it was a guerrilla war fought between the United States and the Filipinos. So the Filipino fighters were not uniformed per se. They were fighting a sort of war of ambush, sabotage, a war without front lines. And to deal with this, the United States responded with actions that, were quite brutal and resulted in a great deal of civilian deaths. And so General Jacob Smith had been quoted as effectively saying, "Kill everyone over 10." And so you have this criticism in the New York Journal where above the American flag here is, rather than an eagle, a vulture. And of course you see American soldiers executing young Filipinos. And the caption, which you can't see, read something to the effect of, "Their only crime was to have been born over 10 years since the United States decided to conquer the Philippines effectively." The Philippine American War brought to light actions of torture, known as the water cure, civilian killings, violence against civilians. It brought up racist perspectives on both sides of the United States' political discussion. And so it really not only shaped society, but it really challenged sort of American core ideas, providing or relating to really the principle of human rights and equality, and so forth. And so we're going to be reading about this and examining and thinking about this week. So, and this is just one example of a very critical sort of political cartoon during this period of time. There were others referencing, like the famous, or the infamous, I really should say, or the well-known Life magazine cover featuring American soldiers torturing a Filipino fighter. And by the way, during the war, it should be noted that the United States, it was sometimes questioned. It's like, well, the treatment of people, the Filipino fighters, was such that it did not seem to fall in accord with the accepted legal rules of war. For example, Emilio Aguinaldo, who was the Filipino nationalist fighter that was leading the war against the United States, he was ultimately captured. And the way he was captured was basically by having soldiers disguise themselves to then capture Emilio Aguinaldo. Well, that was considered to be, is considered to be a violation of accepted accords of war. And there was some criticism of this on the floors of the U.S. Congress, but ultimately proponents and supporters of the U.S. War effectively argued that, well, the guerrillas themselves are not signatories on those conventions, and they are irregular fighters. They're not wearing uniforms. They're not conforming to the standard of what a legal combatant is. And so because they're illegal combatants, those international laws, those international rules of war don't actually apply to them, and the United States doesn't have to uphold them. Which then raises another huge question about how, given the core ideas of the United States surrounding human rights, surrounding justice, surrounding fair treatment, does a technicality like that, it challenges American core ideas if you're calling a technicality as a way to sort of not recognize those types of things. Okay, so Last thing, and I think you do want to hear this last thing. So the last thing is extra credit. Every week for watching these announcements, I do offer extra credit. And because I want you watching these announcements, and I want you watching these announcements early in the week so we kind of understand where we're going in the class. And so the way this is going to work is every announcement, I will mention an interesting fact of history that relates to what we're talking about. And in our class, in modules, you're going to see a little extra credit discussion board, and all you have to do is go in there and post a summary of the factoid. And here is the factoid. The factoid is basically based on what I've already just said. And that is that the War of the Philippines was a particularly brutal conflict. And a conflict, it was a guerrilla war, and it was a conflict where the United States, fueled in part by racism towards the Filipino people, and also fueled by its attempt to combat this guerrilla war, that kind of blurred the lines between civilian and combatant. The United States engaged in a particularly brutal war. And one of the elements of that brutal war was effectively a standard practice of torture. And the torture was typically called the water cure. And the water cure, which you'll read about this week, the water cure was a form of torture that was particularly harsh and could result in not only harm, but even death in some cases. And the United States used torture called the water cure in its war in the Philippines. And it was criticized in Life magazine, on the cover of Life magazine, that criticized the United States and effectively brought to light the idea that the United States was effectively engaging in a behavior that was not unlike the behavior of its sort of colonial world powers, its European colonial world powers, that for so long the United States had suggested that it somehow set apart from. So that's the factoid. Go into that extra credit discussion board in our modules area and just write a little summary in there, and you'll earn bonus points. And the bonus points will be added to a test score at the end of the term. So let's have fun with this. And even though, given the subject, our topics are not always fun in this course, because we're talking about violent wars, and we're talking about how they also shape American society. And that's what we're going to be reading about this week. And don't forget, there's no major discussion forum. Our major assignments this week are the 2 quizzes, and those will be available by Wednesday. I promise all of these announcements won't be quite this long, but because I wanted to give us as much information as we could, this one's a little bit long. So let's have a great week, and please let me know if you have any questions, and I look forward to seeing those quizzes, and I look forward to reading your responses in the extra credit discussion board. By the way, extra credit discussion board must be completed Thursday at the latest. Let's have a great week, everyone.